Hey, well, good morning. Welcome back. It is so good to have you guys back again. We are in a third week of a series called DNA, the core of the church. And so, if this is your first time here, we're going to dive right into week 3. But I'll try to catch you guys up. If you're watching online for the first time, we're just glad that you're here. We are been really just talking about this concept of DNA. Just kind of hit me. DNA is something that we obviously know. Every living organism has it. It's part of life. Everything has this strand of DNA that makes up our characteristics and our eye color and everything about us that makes us who we are. And so I was just trying to think about what that looks like in aspect of the church. Like, what is the DNA of our local church? What should it be, and how do we make sure that we are operating within the DNA that God gave us? And so the first thing that week 1 we talked about faith, that in order, if you're going to be a believer and follower in Jesus Christ, there has to come a point in time in our life when you have faith. You choose to believe. You choose to make some kind of decision to step in to following Christ. You believe that he's a real person, that he died, but what really stretches us is that we believe that he was actually rose from the grave. And so that there has to be some kind of courageous faith or something that we do that compels us. And then last week I talked about this compulsion. Like, there's something that should compel each and every one of us to share this message with other people. We should be compelled. We should see things like Jesus sees them, and then we should react accordingly. Like, there should be something within the heart of all of us that pushes us into some sort of direction. And so last week I asked you a question, and it was really just to gauge where you're at in your life. Like, when it comes to lost people or people who don't know Jesus, people who, whatever you want to call them, are lost or far from God, or there's all kinds of different names, but they're just people that do not know, that they really don't have any kind of relationship with Jesus or the church or anything like that. And then my question was, what do we do with those? Do we see those people like God sees them? What is our response to that? And is it like, are we on the scale from a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being completely apathetic? Like, when you go to work and you go to Walmart and you are at a ball game or wherever you're at in the community, I'm talking about anywhere but here through the week, and you see people, do you see them as, hey, these are lost, these are people that need to know Jesus? Or do we just see them as people and we really don't give it any thought? We're completely apathetic to that. Then you're probably a 1 on this scale, okay? If on the opposite end of the scale is we're like Jesus. We're completely motivated and consumed. It's our mission. When we see people, we have a natural tendency to say, man, I wonder if they know Jesus. I wonder, do they have any kind of relationship with Christ? And you would be a 10 on that scale. So I don't know where you graded yourself at on that last week. I did have somebody come up to me after the service last week, and she was like, hey, I'm probably a 1. And I love that honesty, right? Because most of us won't have the courage to admit that we're a 1. And what I loved about her response too is like, I'm a 1, but I really don't want to be. And I don't want to stay a 1, which is awesome. Right? Because that's really what we're talking about here. And is this core of our DNA. So how do we move from a 1 to closer to being like Jesus, which is on the 10? Maybe we won't get to a 10 in this lifetime, but maybe we can get to a 4 or a 3 or an 8 or a 10. We can get closer in that scale, right? And so I love that. And some of us, there's a quote that I quote often. Andy Stanley, who pastors a church in Atlanta, he has a quote about Jesus, and I love this quote. He says, there was something about Jesus, excuse me, that people who were nothing like him liked him. So you kind of have to think about that for a second, if you're like me. But there was something about Jesus, this guy named Jesus. When we read about him in our Bible, there was something about that guy that people who were absolutely nothing like him, from a moral standard, from habits and likes and everything that they did in their lives, they were absolutely nothing like Jesus. But they liked him. They liked being around him. They ate with him. They hung out with him. And so when you think about that, and then you think about, well, how does that relate to us? He was irresistible to people. And my question is, do we have the kind of faith or DNA in each one of us that are equally irresistible to people who are nothing like us? And there's another quote by Andy. He goes on in his book, Irresistible is where this came from, and he says this. This is really interesting. It says, while many of us have been working hard to make church more interesting, a lot of us do that. Like some of you volunteer, you know, we got kids back there. We try to make church interesting here on Sunday morning. So, people that don't know come in here and they're like, okay. It says, while some of us have been working hard to make church more interesting, it turns out that fewer people are actually interested, which is a trend that we see in culture today in America. The church attendance is it has been on a decline for years. Like when you look at that on a chart, church attendance in America is on a sharp decline. And actually, there is a rise of people that they are referring to as the nuns. That means like when you check your religion on some kind of form or whatever, most people will check the box nun. There's actually a book out called The Rise of the Nuns, and that's what we're experiencing in America, is that there's this idea that while we are doing everything we can to make church more interesting, fewer people are finding it interesting. And he goes on, he says, and while most people outside the church continue to have a favorable view of Jesus, they don't necessarily have a favorable view of his body, which is the church, which is interesting to me. Like on the outside, people that aren't here this morning and represented by empty chairs, whatever, people who are nothing like Jesus, people who haven't made the commitment to follow him, don't believe it's real, whatever reason, I don't know, just had a bad experience at church or whatever, for whatever reason, Jesus and Christ have no bearing on their life. They have this positive view of Jesus, but they really don't have a positive view of us, which make up the church, which is fascinating to me. Like, what are we doing wrong? Like, how do we fix that? Because that's not the result we want, right? Like, that's not the result that any of us would desire for our church. So how do we fix that? And so I got to thinking about the first church, and it was in Acts. You can read about it. It was after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Church was not like it is, like it wasn't like this, right? Okay, this was never the goal. You understand that, right? Like as much as I love church, this was never the goal. And I wondered what was so compelling and so what made these first Christians, like the first disciples, what was it that made their faith so compelling and so resilient and in the end irresistible? Like how did the disciples and people like them have such an incredible passion and tenacity for spreading the gospel of Jesus? Like what drove them? What was that compulsion that did that? It wasn't so they could get more members to their church or, it had nothing to do with that. And it had everything to do with people. So my question to you is this. I have a random question for y'all, and I want you all to think about it personally, where you are in your life. Here's the question. Is there anyone that you were acquainted with, anybody you know in your life, is there anyone that you're acquainted with that as a believer and follower of Jesus Christ, as a church member, or I don't even care if you're a member, as a person who loves Jesus and follows Jesus, and you believe that you're saved Christian, is there anyone that you are acquainted with in your life that you would love to see make a commitment and follow Jesus? Is there anybody like that? Was there a face or a name that popped into your head? There should be, right? Like there's that there's those people. Maybe it's somebody you work with, you go to school with, maybe an old friend, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a child. But there's probably that one person or maybe multiple people in our life that we think about and go, man, how awesome would it be if they found Jesus? We love that, right? Like we would love that if they did. And we're not judging them or anything like that, but they're just people in our life that it's pretty obvious that there's not any kind of valid relationship with Christ in their life. Do you have any compassion for those people is what I'm asking. And is there anything that would compel you to do anything to reach that person so that they might come to know Jesus and have a relationship with him? Now, Anybody like to fish? I love to fish. I'm horrible at it. Okay, I'm just not good at it. Like I have fished since I was fished since I was little. Like I can remember we lived in Kentucky when I was little, and I can remember my dad taking me down below the spillway at the dam in Kentucky Lake, and we fished. Like I've caught fish, I just not consistently. Like in fact, when my brother and I go, we have this in my head. I have visions of just a cooler packed with crappie, and then I don't ever get that. So. I'm just not good at it. And I go with other people that are good. I go fishing, like my neighbor, John Bunnell, he's really good, fishes a lot, catches a lot of fish. I've gone, I've been around Travis Gillett and other people who like win boats and junk fishing, It's like they're just really good at fishing. I'm horrible at it. I want to be good. I'm just not good at it, right? And so every time I go with somebody like that, I learn something. Like I figure out, oh, well, I didn't know you could tie a knot like that. Or, oh, that's how you keep your pole from being untangled. Like I always have a bird's nest. I always end up losing my lure. I get hung up. It's just never a really fun, super great experience because I stink, okay? It's not because I lack passion. It's just I'm not good at it. I don't know how. And so every time I go with somebody they always teach me something new. And so it's the same thing with people. And Jesus actually, we're fishers of men, right? So here's where that passage comes from. It's Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 through 20. He was selecting his disciples, and Jesus said this. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting their nets into the lake, for they were fishermen. That's what they did. They were good at it. They caught fish. And so Jesus, walking by, sees these guys, and he says, come follow me. And here's what he says, I will make you fishers of people. I will send you out to fish for people. That's what he says. At once they left their nets and followed him. So they dropped their normal fishing life and followed Jesus to fish for people. So my question to you this morning, and the whole DNA thing is, are we fishing for people? It is less about church and more about people. Now that's hard for me to say, right? Less about church, and because I love church. It's what we do. It's what we know. It's what we're comfortable with. But when I read about Jesus and his disciples, I don't ever really read many scriptures that says, and Jesus went out and encouraged everybody to go to church. He did not do that. Disciples did not do that. Now, I love that. We do that today. I don't want to discourage that, right? Because we love church. But church in that day was just a byproduct of people. It was a byproduct that happened as a result of disciples building relationships with people, and then they came to know Jesus, and then they wanted to meet together, and they wanted to talk about it, and they wanted to share meals together, and they wanted to be together. That's how church started. It was never the goal. Like this on Sunday, Jesus didn't go, and I leave and go and have church. It's not what he said. He said, I will make you fishers of people. It is about people and less about church. Now, for years, we've worked hard to get people to come to church, right? Like we want to, because we think that's the answer. That's what we've been programmed to do. Like bring a friend, invite, and trust me, most people that find Jesus, a lot of people, that statistically, it's because somebody invited them to church. So I know there's valid in that. I'm not downplaying that. We still want you to invite people to church. I still want you to bring a friend. I still love church. I still want you to invite people. That's the goal. I get it. And I think the goal I get it is we bring them, and then hopefully they see that we're not all like a bunch of crazy lunatics and handling snakes and drinking poison and, whatever, doing weird dance. I don't know. People have different experiences at church, and we want them to come to our church. I'm like, no, it's really normal. But have you ever invited somebody to church, and then you're like, no, really, it's cool. I think you'll like it. We're pretty laid back. And then you bring, on the Sunday that they finally come, it happens to be Weird Sunday. Do you ever have that? Like it's nothing like it ever was before. Like they're all of a sudden, hey, today we've got a special tambourine lady, and it's just weird, and then you have to explain to your friends like, no, really, it's not ever like that. I promise you, it's not. Don't freak out. And so that's why we work really hard to have a consistent experience around here. But here's the issue with that. And I believe the Holy Spirit can work in any environment. But church is and church is absolutely a conduit for that. But church doesn't reach everybody. It's not for everybody. Like you stand up, you sit down, there's pews, there's bad memories. It's easy to be critical of church. I mean, regardless, I mean, there's something that happens that you have the problem with church. The worship was not the way you liked it. They didn't sing the songs you liked. The lights were in my eyes. Music was too loud. The preacher was boring and preached too long, which I know never happens here. But let's face it. Can we just get real for a second? And there has been a moment in your church career where you have had a problem with church, right? Somewhere along the line, something went sideways, and man, made me mad or made me upset, and you go find another church, and then you realize, as hard as we have tried, to this date, we have yet to make it where everybody is happy. It's just hard to do. I mean, my question is there DNA about church or is it about people? Does our church DNA, that's the question I'm trying to answer. Church, when I say our church, I'm talking about all of us together. Look around you. People in front of you and beside you and behind you and tables in the back. And this is church. This is Salem Grace. All of us. It's all of you. It's me. Does our church fish for people? Do you fish for people? That's the question. Are you fishing for people? Or are you just coming to church? To a place? In some ways, if we're not careful, we'll begin to think that church, it's just the pastor's job, and we expect the lost to come to us, and we think if we turn the lights on and have cool lights, and we flip the lights on Sunday morning, and we post on social media, hey, we're open at 9 and 11, and then we just come in here and sit. I think our goal is, we hope that lost people will just be drawn to this place like moth to a flame, and they'll just come wandering in here aimlessly. Now, that happens, right? It happens from time. Have you ever seen the Asian carp videos? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, if you don't know, there's these thing called Asian carp. They live in rivers. They're an invasive species. They don't like it. Nature people hate it. But anyway, they're an invasive species. And what happens is you get in your john boat. If you haven't seen these videos, I'm going to show you. You can get in your john boat with your little motor and just cruise down the river, and then fish just jump in the boat. It's crazy. Have you ever seen it? Has anybody ever seen those videos? It's like these giant Asian carp just come flying in the boat, hit people in the face. I think sometimes that's what we think church is. Like if we just get in here and get in our little boat and we just go, like people will just jump in our boat. It doesn't happen like that. We flip on the lights, and it does happen sometimes, right? Like sometimes people wander in here and they have a good experience, and people are nice to them, and they get a cup of coffee and a donut, and they're like, okay, I kind of like this place. I can wear blue jeans and feel like I'm home. And then they come in and they get involved, and they find Jesus, and they make a commitment, and they baptize them, and we're like, yeah! And then we, okay, then we volunteer you, and then you volunteer you to death, and then you quit and leave. It's because it's about church. What if fishing for people was more about people and less about church? I think if we led with that, we wouldn't have to worry about this. We'd be like, we got to get more chairs out. I think in order to do that, there's some things in our DNA that have to exist. And it's this. It starts with courageous relationships, okay? Courageous relationships with people who are absolutely nothing like us. It starts as soon as you guys pull out of this driveway today is when it starts. It's who you come in contact with and who you interact with. When was the last time, just be honest with yourself, ain't nobody grading this paper but you. When is the last time you had the courage to build a relationship with somebody you didn't know? It's awkward. It's hard. We try grow groups in the fall, and it's just like people's arm, like, seriously, get in the grow group. It's good. It's hard. When's the last time you asked somebody to dinner that you didn't know? Invited somebody over to do something new? Someone who you don't know? My question is, are we hanging out in places to meet people who are nothing like us? Or are we just surrounding ourselves with people that are like us and that's safe and it's comfortable and I like people that are like me and like the things that I like and voted for the people I voted for? As much as I love our church, I don't read many stories about Jesus operating like that. I really believe that Jesus would have us build relationships with people who are absolutely nothing like this. And here's how I know, because in Mark chapter 2, there were some teachers of the law, it says in verse 16, some teachers of the law who were Pharisees were there. They saw Jesus eating with sinners and tax collectors who were the scum of the earth at the time. Nobody talked to those people. So they asked his disciples, these Pharisees, went to Jesus' disciples and asked him this question. They said, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Why does he do that? Because it was so counterintuitive to everything that they knew that, if you're Jesus, they thought that Jesus was there for them. I think there's going to be some church people realize that, you know what, Jesus wasn't here for us. He was here for lost people. He left the 99 to find the one. Why does Jesus eat with sinners and prostitutes and broken people and drug addicts and alcoholics and people that when you looked at him, they were like, why is he hanging out with them? Here's his answer, verse 17. On hearing that, Jesus said to them, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous or people who think they are good and goody, and I have not called to come them, but sinners. That's who Jesus was about. And there was something about him that people who were nothing like him liked him. And this very church was born out of the desire to reach those kind of people. It's more than just going to church, it's being the church. But we have to begin with courageous relationships. We have to begin to start building some courageous relationships intentionally. For some of us church people, it's hard. Like we have to go places, do things, and say, we expect everybody to come to church, but we don't want to go where they are. We have to have some courageous relationships. We have to be courageous in that. Second thing, we have to have courageous conversations. Some of you have courageous relationships with people, but you do not have courageous conversations with those people. There's a story in John about a Samaritan woman. Now, if you're a church people and you're church people, you know this story. But if you don't, I'm going to tell you this story. There's this lady, she's a Samaritan. Jesus is a Jew. They did not get along culturally. It was not a thing. They didn't even speak to each other, wouldn't wave at each other, wouldn't even look at each other, wouldn't be in the same room with each other. Okay? Jesus sees this woman sitting at a well, goes up, if you know the story, he starts having this conversation with this lady at the well who's there in midday, which is a weird time, which come to find out there was a reason why she was at the well at that time of day, because she was trying to avoid other people in the town because she had some junk going on in her life and they gave her a hard time over it. And so here's the thing. Jesus begins to build a rapport. He begins this courageous relationship with somebody who is absolutely nothing like him. They begin to talk about water, and hey, she's there getting water, and Jesus is like, hey, let me tell you about a living water that I have, that you drink of this water and you're never going to be thirsty again. And the lady's like, yeah, hey, give me some of that. We'll pick up the story in verse 15, chapter 4, John. The woman said, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming to draw water. And then in verse 16, he said, go call your husband and come back. This is really important. Jesus looked at this lady at the well, having this conversation, building a rapport. He's like, hey, why don't you go? She's like, give me some of this water. He's like, go call your husband and come back. He knew. Verse 17. The lady's like, well, I don't have a husband. She replied. And Jesus said to her, yeah, you're right when you say you have no husband. And here's where he drops the bomb. Here's where the courageous conversation comes in place. Verse 18, the fact is, Jesus takes it a step further. Yeah, I know you don't have a husband. The fact is, you've had 5 of them. Oh, snap, just got awkward. And the man you have now, not only have you had 5 husbands, the dude you're with now, he's not even your husband. She's like, oh. That's a courageous conversation, my friends. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands. The man you have now is not your husband. What you have said is quite true. He had the courageous relationship, built the rapport, but you know what? Jesus had this way of talking to people because he loved them. And if you read the rest of that story, you'll read that Jesus wasn't intimidated by the awkward truth. He spoke the truth to this woman. She didn't get offended and storm off. She didn't like, well, how dare you, and leave. Jesus didn't dwell on her sin. He didn't beat her over the head with it. Anytime you hear Jesus talk in relation to sin, it's always about redemption, not about condemnation. It was always about that. Jesus didn't dwell on her sin, spoke to her, it didn't matter, talked to her about worshiping God. Then he told her he was the Messiah. And the Samaritan woman put her faith in Jesus, who knew all about her faults, yet he loved and respected her. He spoke the truth in love. And in John chapter 4, verse 39, it says, many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, he told me everything I did. From that point on, she went and told everybody that she knew about this guy that she met at the well that changed her life. If we genuinely have any concern or care about lost people, we will love them enough to tell them the truth. And sometimes that hurts. To speak the truth into the relationships where we have earned the right to do so. And some of you have those kind of relationships. You've just been too chicken to have that conversation. Not to judge them and beat them up for their sin. It's just to merely tell them about the truth that the gospel speaks. It's a courageous conversation. And then that's followed by courageous actions. We have a saying that I say around here all the time, and I got to hurry. But it says, we'll do anything short of sin to reach people who don't know Christ. To reach people that no one is reaching, we'll do the things that no one wants to do. And what does that look like? Well, let me tell you what that looks like. There's a story in Mark chapter 2, and it's about a guy who brought their buddy on a mat to see Jesus. Let me read it. Verse 1. A few days later, when Jesus entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such a large number that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. So here's the stage. Jesus came home. He's preaching in this house. It's packed. People, there's no way to get into the house. Some men came bringing a paralyzed man who they know if they could get that guy to Jesus, he could fix everything that's wrong in his life. Some men bringing a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. He had 4 buddies that cared enough to carry his paralyzed body and bring him to Jesus. It says, since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, somebody hatched an idea. One of the 4 said, hey, I got an idea. They made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it and then lowered the mat he was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, son, your sins are forgiven. These guys took some courageous action to get their buddy to Jesus. And sometimes that takes a couple things. It takes bearing someone's burden. Let me read verse 3 again. It says, some men bringing to Jesus a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. Sometimes it means taking the burden on of somebody and literally carrying them to Jesus. It means when they have a diagnosis, you're there for them. It means when they're hurting, you listen. It means when they're having a baby, you throw a shower. It means when their mom dies, you go to the funeral. It means when you're sick, you bring them a meal. That's what it looks like bearing burdens for people. That's what these guys did. And then the second thing you have to do, it's basically letting people know that you care. And then the second thing you have to do is you have to break some rules. Did anybody ever go swimming immediately after eating? I just want to see your hands. Y'all have broken the rule. You're supposed to wait 30 minutes. Shame on you. I've never done that. Not all true. In fact, I never wore a helmet. Very rarely wear a seatbelt. I think when Chris was little, he sat on the armrest of the front seat of the car. 2-year-old just sitting up there because he was golden child. Got the good seat. I ran with scissors and drank from the hose and sniffed some magic markers maybe. Ate some cherry chapstick, We've done stuff that we shouldn't do. Sometimes it means breaking the rules. It says, since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof by digging through it and lowered the mat that Jesus was, so that he was lying on so he could see Jesus. In those days, the roof was actually literally made of manure. Did you know that? They'd take manure and mud and straw and make these houses. And so these guys literally dug through poo-poo. Can you say poo-poo in church, I think? They dug through poo-poo to get their buddy to Jesus. What are you willing to dig through? Do you care enough to get people to Jesus? What are you willing to do for that person you thought of earlier? What are you willing to do for them so that they might come to know a God that loves them so much? Our church is good at this. We really are. I think we have this DNA in us. We do a lot of those things. Some of you serve and give and give and give, and we do funeral dinners and we care for people in our community. We really do our best. But we're all trying to get to that 10, right? We want to be just a little bit more like Jesus. I see a church here before me that we don't judge people without Christ. We just love them to Christ. Jesus didn't come for the healthy, he came for the sick. I see people who bear burdens and break rules. And I see a group of people that will do anything short of sin to reach people for Jesus. It's interesting. I got a letter. I'm just going to share this real quick. As a pastor, sometimes you get letters. And this one wasn't signed. And so typically those aren't good. I mean, typically when you get an unsigned letter, I'm like, oh no, buckle up, here it comes. But this one actually was pretty good. There's a guy that was here last week on Mother's Day. And he said this. He said, when I was leaving the 9 a.m. Mother's Day service, there was a hitchhiker going into Salem. If you set that up or the Lord set it up, I must say I was strongly convicted by not stopping and giving the guy a ride and sharing God's love with a captive audience. Of all the cars coming out of your church, no one stopped. Perhaps in Illinois has a law on picking up hitchhikers. He was from out of state. All I know is I was guilty and my excuses, although somewhat viable, like my passenger seat was full of stuff and on the floorboard, and I was a little late to meet with my mom, etc., etc. All lame excuses in the grand scheme of lost sheep. Possibilities. Perhaps others leaving your church had the same convictions, and I would have hoped that somebody stopped. I actually heard that somebody did stop. Bottom line, he thanks me for challenging him, for the Holy Spirit to convict and hopefully motivate a chicken Christian like me to do something with the gift of God's DNA. That's the goal. Is that we just do something. After the first service, somebody handed me this little note, and it's a quote by Irma Bombeck, and I want to read it. It says, when I stand before God at the end of my life, I would hope that I would not have a single bit of talent left and could say, I used everything you gave me. That's what I want to say. That's the type of church DNA that I want us to have. That we will build courageous relationships with people who are nothing like us. That will lead us to have courageous conversations. And that will compel us to have courageous actions. We are not doing it as a church unless you are. Because we are the church. Have you stand with me? Father, thank you so much for your word and what it teaches us and how, Lord, it challenges us. Lord, I'm thankful for this church. I'm thank you for the passion of people in this church to reach our community. Lord, I just pray that this would be personal to us as we leave here today. That, Lord, that we would begin to build courageous relationships with people who are nothing like us. And Lord, in those moments, whenever you lead, that we don't force it, but God, whenever there's an opportunity, we step to the plate and have a courageous conversation with somebody that we care about. Lord, I just pray that you would lead us into courageous actions and that we would be the kind of church that you would have us to be in our community. Thank you for that DNA that you have already instilled in this place, Lord. It's evident in the things that that you've used us to accomplish. And I pray that you would continue to do that. Take us from this place, but not your presence, Jesus. Make us better people and more like you. In your name I pray. Amen. Have a great week. See y'all soon.